So we are now recording, and say thank you for joining me today on this webinar. It'll be about 30, 40, maybe an hour, depending on sort of what questions you might have for me at the end of it. And as I said, it's about discussing why investigations go wrong, particularly in the workplace, and what we can do to avoid it. So I will share a screen. And here we are. So I'll just do an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. So obviously I'm going to introduce myself and why I've basically chosen this topic to share on a webinar. And then obviously we're going to talk about some employment tribunal rulings and look at the hindrances to investigations. And then I'm going to just discuss bias and cognitive interviewing techniques. And then I'll talk about, what we do here, who we are, some Q&A sessions, and obviously thank you. So hopefully that covers everything that we'll be tackling today, and you'll hopefully you'll find something useful out of the session today. So let's just do an introduction. So first of all, my name is Gary Rogers. I'm head of investigations here at Lexham Corporate Services. So essentially, we're a corporate services company. We do corporate finance. We do some legal support work. We do some HR support work as well. Predominantly, we do a lot of investigation work, which is why I'm here. For clients, large organisations, small organisations, predominantly around fraud, bribery, corruption, whistleblowing investigations, and I might share some of those experiences as we go through today. So what we're going to talk about is why investigations go wrong. So we're going to discuss why do investigations go wrong. We're going to explore that. And usually you'll find that investigations go wrong when they're scrutinised. Now, whether that's internally a disciplinary hearing, or whether it's an appeal hearing, or even it's externally in terms of a regulator, potentially, or more importantly, a tribunal court hearing. For those of you on the call today, especially if you're involved in employment investigations, you'll know what an employment tribunal can be like to attend, and I might share some of my experience of having done that, good and bad, and that's what we're going to discuss. So this is all drawn from my experience. So I've been involved in investigations for, it's coming up to 35 years. I've worked in the private, public and law enforcement sectors, and a range of investigations, and as I said, I've had some experience of going to court and employment tribunals and giving evidence and presenting and supporting some of my investigations and disciplinary hearing judgments as well. So we're just going to talk about that today. So I'm going to start with some very recent employment tribunal rulings that really emphasise why I've sort of put this webinar together for you, for everyone today. So this particular case was an employee at DPD Group. Now, this was a food company, food distribution company, and essentially Mr. Morty, the employee, basically he took food that was left over, was unclaimed at the end of the day. So he took this food home and he was caught, he was videoed, he was captured, and he was interviewed, and he said, well, actually it's the company culture. We encouraged, rather than food waste, if there's food left over, we can take it, and then whatever's left after that is distributed out. So rushed through to a disciplinary hearing, was found to have breached company policy. I believe it was around the grounds of theft, gross misconduct, and dismissed. And his argument was that actually it was unfairly dismissed because he'd said that this was a culture that other employees, he gave examples of other employees who took food at the end of a shift that wasn't claimed, that was out of date, and that wasn't considered. And the employment tribunal actually, as you can see here, found in his favour. There was no actual desire to investigate his claims, and that the investigation was flawed because they'd already made a judgment that he was guilty, and so they dismissed him. And so they found in favour it was an unfair dismissal claim. And this was February this year. So this isn't something that, I've talked about this for 4 or 5 years now, and it's always the same. This isn't a new thing. These investigations fail constantly. when they found that excuse me while I just bring some people in. Okay, so yeah, it's a constant theme that I find. So this one is even more recent. This is March this year, and unfortunately, this is with an NHS Foundation Trust. Now, many of you, I bet, are following some of the NHS media stories around its culture, in particular around bullying and harassment, some recent cases of racism, some cases, and also around your investigation. And this one was to Mrs. Sawyers, who worked at an NHS Foundation Trust. And the tribunal again found the investigation was completely inadequate and that the investigator's decision was biased. And it was biased against, you know, the respondent, Mrs. Sawyers here. And they found that the investigator had failed to conduct even the most basic of investigation principles, which is interviewing the claimant. And also that she recorded inaccurate reasons for closing the investigation. And again, an unfair dismissal claim. So these are two recent examples, but actually there are many more. And these are just some that are from, you know, all over the place. You can see here from Cairo, you can see here about a killing, you know, in Ukraine, sexual misconduct, and having recently completed an investigation into sexual misconduct allegations is a very serious topic investigation. This was again a flawed investigation. And also a lawsuit here that was filed in the US because this was at a university where it had ignored complaints from women about one of the students, and that there was a history of mishandling these type of cases. So it's not uncommon the investigations fail and they're flawed. And as you can see, it's reputationally damaging to organisations. There's also the financial implications. If you consider that there's no cap on discriminations, you know, under the Equalities Act of 2010, protected characteristics, there's no cap on the tribunal can award that. So the implications financially to organisations, if it's a small organisation, could be catastrophic. So it really is important that investigations are conducted correctly. But why do investigations go wrong? Why do they fail? These people who conduct these investigations, they're not all, you know, novices. They're not all new to the area. They're probably professionals in their own right. Some of them are managers, and you would think, like to think, hope that they're trained and they receive the right training to manage people, conduct investigations. But continually we find they go wrong. Why is that? What is the issue? Well, first of all, let's look at the hindrances to investigations. There are a number of barriers. So the first one I put up here is cooperation. Now, I don't know about you, if you've experienced this in your area, but I can tell you now, I've recently conducted an investigation where the respondent just would not cooperate with the investigation whatsoever. Several opportunities were afforded to participate in an interview to gather the information from the respondent, yet just would not cooperate. And that causes a barrier. And then, you know, for people who are not comfortable, or maybe not confident in investigations, they're not trained, and they sort of wonder, what do I do? Where do I go? Sometimes they make the wrong choice. There's also peer pressure. I've worked for an organisation for 20 years doing investigations, and there is some peer pressure, particularly when it's politically motivated. And there are political motivations behind, you know, the outcome of an investigation. So you get peer pressure. I remember one, it was a disciplinary hearing where, in fact, this individual, the managers who put them forward, and I was the chair on this particular hearing, were saying, well, this person's known to have a bad attendance record, and they've done this and they've done that. And so there was this pressure for to find the case against this individual. Now, in that particular case, the flawed investigation, funnily enough, hence this webinar of me speaking to. But again, it was, you know, this peer pressure is there. It's evident. It's tangible. the retention of evidence. If you don't conduct your investigation swiftly, identify the evidence that's required, and then capture that evidence, you may lose evidence. And sometimes even the retention of that evidence, how many times we hear, well, yeah, we had this evidence, but we can't find it now. This is something that's evidence. So it's really important. The time it takes to conduct an investigation, and I hear a lot of criticism about this. Certainly see a lot of criticism on posts. But the one thing I've always been conscious of is that many times the investigator is actually a manager. They do another job. They have a day job. And they're trying to fit this investigation in with their day job commitments. And suddenly what you're finding is, before you even know it, unintentionally, you've got time lag. Suddenly, what seems like a day or two is suddenly a week or 3 or 4. But in that time, if you've seen a post recently, I saw a post about some allegations regarding the red arrows. If you've seen that in the RAF, and I just saw a recent post where he said, the time lapse, the time that the investigation team got to the witnesses, some of them didn't even want to participate. So again, time. Personal agenda. How many times have any of you been involved in investigations where there's a personal agenda behind the complaint? Suddenly you're looking at potentially a vexatious complaint. It causes a barrier in your investigation. There may be a personal agenda of the person who's commissioned you to do the investigation. And then we're talking about the culture of the organisation. You're trying to be impartial, you're trying to be objective, and the culture of the organisation is they close ranks, for example. Comes back to then cooperation, lack of cooperation, something the investigator has to overcome. And then one which I'm sure we're all very, very aware of, which is competence. The competency of an investigator, of the person to do the investigation thoroughly, objectively, thusly, and understand what it is they're investigating, they're looking at, and how to conduct an investigation. Actually, I found there are 2 key areas that seem to be a constant in flawed investigations. 2 areas, just 2. The other stuff we've talked about are barriers and they're small, minor issues, but actually 2 key areas I find contribute to investigations being criticised, found in this case. I gave the ET examples, employment tribunal examples there. Found that actually it's led to a hearing, it's led to a dismissal, which is ultimately found to be unfair. And the first of those is bias, okay? Both conscious and unconscious, or intentional or unintentional, whichever phrase you want to use, but bias as a whole seems to be one of the biggest factors. And that's not just bias of the individuals on the hearing panel, it's actually the bias of the investigator themselves. So I'm actually going to run a little test, okay? And I'm going to show you a picture. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give you all 10 seconds, just 10 seconds. I have a stopwatch here. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to look at this picture and answer a question I'm going to put to you. Now, this question I'm going to put onto polls. He says, hopefully. So I'm going to go onto polls. I'm going to share this poll with you, okay? And I'm going to give you 10 seconds to answer it, okay? So, as I said, I'm going to show you a picture, okay? And the question is, would you trust this man or not, okay? And as I said, hopefully you can see that poll, by the way. I'm going to give you 10 seconds, and those 10 seconds will start now. 10 seconds. Would you trust this man? Yes or no? Yes or no? Would you trust this man? That's it. That's your time up. That's how quickly 10 seconds goes. Okay. So, would you trust this man? Yes or no? So let's look at what the results show. 100% said yes. Okay, excellent, excellent. So you all said yes, you would trust this man. Those of you that responded, thank you. Okay, now that's, a little example. I just want to illustrate why I've used that. It takes 1/10 of a second, 1/10 of a 1 second to you to form an opinion of somebody based on their face. So just looking at them, it takes you 1/10 of a second to form an impression of you, an opinion of that individual. And the longer you look at them, it doesn't change your opinion dramatically. So let me put that into context for you. Right? Within 1/10 of a second of seeing me on this webinar, you'd formed an opinion of me, and the longer you saw me is unlikely to dramatically change your opinion of me. That's quite astonishing. Okay, but why is that important? Because the way you form your opinion of me is based upon bias. Okay, so what is bias? So this is what psychology today defines biases, but I'll explain. You can all read that. I'll explain it to you a little bit simpler. We all have bias, okay, because it's drawn from our life experiences, the people we meet, the programs we watch, the family we grew up with, our friends, okay, our work experiences, our work life, the experiences we have on the street, shops, everything. Everything around us is absorbed. And as we grow from the time that we're old enough to retain memories, right the way up to adulthood, maybe on to our old age, it defines our opinion of people. And it's drawn on those experiences. So every single one of us has a bias. And they're good, but they're also bad. What it means is I will judge someone on my own experiences, but the same person could be judged differently by someone else because of their biases. So why is bias a common theme in investigations? Well, because we all have them. But why is it important in investigations? It's the value of objectivity, okay? As we said earlier, I mentioned earlier, as an investigator, you must make clear, objective decisions based upon the evidence that's presented to you. Quite difficult when you consider, I've just said every single one of us has bias. You have to provide an evidence-based decision-making process, okay, to support your outcomes in the investigation. And you must be able to justify them, because that maintains your professional reputation as an investigator. So bias influences our thoughts, our perceptions, our decision making. It's not based on fact, it's based on experience. So bias will lead to a failure in your investigation. It will damage your objectivity as an investigator, okay, and your reputation, if you don't understand you have bias, if you don't understand what triggers your bias and what your bias are, and then make sure that that doesn't influence your investigation, because it will lead you, as we've seen, in an employment tribunal or a court, where you will be challenged. Okay? So the important thing for an investigator is always knowing your bias. And one of the things I've said on a number of sessions I do, whether it's training or webinars, is great believer in peer review. Always check in with someone else. When you're doing an investigation, you've got the evidence, or you're conducting your interviews, because bias is just as important in interviews. We'll talk about that. It's speaking to a peer, fellow investigator, someone who's close to you, to say, look, just read through this. does it make sense to you? Am I prejudging? Am I making, am I making opinion-based decisions rather than evidence-based decisions? So it's really important. I mean, I gave you 10 seconds. I mean, you all said you trusted the guy, right? And your decision was based on your initial interpretation, but that was 10 seconds. Consider that your view, your opinion of an individual when you see him is already made up in a tenth of a second. So this is a key area for me. One of two key areas to talk about is bias. Bias can also be, to give an example, if you're asked to do an investigation into a member of your team, so let's say you're a line manager and you receive a complaint, and that complaint is against a member of staff who in your opinion, your view, is a very good member of staff, never had any trouble with them before, they're really high performing, and you get this complaint. Straight away, your bias is going to be, well, this employee is brilliant, it's a great employee. This complaint can't be true. So you're already dismissing this complaint. And it may not even be as blatant as that. You might look at it and go, no, I'm going to look at this thoroughly. But in the back of your mind, you're always thinking that this person's a really good employee. So it's really important to bear that in mind. Understanding your bias as an investigator, understanding how it can influence, and always seeking to justify or get peer review. I believe in, as I said, on your investigation. Am I on the right track? Is this correct? Have I got the evidence to support the conclusions that I'm making? So the second aspect is investigation interviews. Now, this is a common perception, and again, we're talking about bias here and perceptions. When you invite someone in for an interview relating to an investigation, believe it or not, most of them will have this image of what's going to take place in that interview. Right? Because they'll be influenced, more than likely, and that's not making a generalization here, but more than likely they're going to be influenced by television, because you're conducting an investigation or invited to a fact-finding interviews on undertaking investigation into A, B, and C. They see investigation, they see interview, they go, oh my God, I've watched these police shows, and they're going to get me in and they're going to interrogate me, which obviously is not right. But that's their perception. As an investigator, you have to understand that. You have to understanding and come in with that perception. And while I've got this slide up, and it fits into what I'm going to talk about next on interviewing techniques. They will also have a perception of how that investigation is going to take place. And most of them, and I wonder if many of you have seen these reality or these particularly American police programs where they show real life cases and interviews, where they undertake a technique where they call them in and they go, okay, you can tell me what happened. And then the person will say, oh, it was nothing to do with me. And they'll go, well, actually, we know it was because we've got this video. And then they'll pressure them, we've got this DNA. We know you've got your DNA. Remembering that in police interviews in America, they can tell lies. They can elaborate, they have information. And they go, well, you don't worry, we know it wasn't you. We know you're not that type of person. But if you tell us what really happened, if you tell us, we know you did it, tell us what happened, we'll let you go. So they dangle this carrot, sort of, and I'm sure you've seen as well, leads to these number of false confessions, highly publicised, of people being convicted. This type of technique is called the REID technique. It's called REID technique. Now, the REID technique is actually heavily criticised for false confessions, but it's also incorrectly applied by those police officers in America. And I'll explain and justify why I'm saying that. The REID technique, designed by a psychologist and a criminologist by the name of Professor Reed, and a number of his colleagues, is intended as an investigative interview technique for someone that the police have reasonable grounds or strong suspicion of being guilty or of being a suspect. Okay, and the idea of that technique is to try to draw them into telling them what happened and obviously confessing. Unfortunately, you find it's used on a number of, basically everyone who is interviewed is considered a suspect, and so this technique is used. And it is heavily criticised. I'm not a fan of it myself. It's certainly got no place in workplace investigations. So, taking this aside, you need to ensure that the perception your witnesses have is more like this. It's more like a conversation, because your role as an investigator is actually trying to obtain the facts. You want this individual's version of events as they record them. You want them to feel comfortable. You want them to trust you. You're building a rapport, remember. So when you're, as an investigator, one of the key things is building a rapport with the witness you're interviewing. No matter who it is, whether it's the complainant, respondent, or obviously an independent witness, you're trying to build a rapport. You're trying to say, or you're trying to portray to this individual that I'm an investigator, I'm here to get the facts. I want to be objective, so I just want your version of it. Tell me what you recall happened. And I am a very, very keen advocate, supporter. I deliver training on this. I'm sure some of you out there will know this technique. And it's called cognitive interviewing. Okay. So there's been a number of psychological evaluations of this technique of interviewing. This technique of interviewing is designed to draw memories from individuals based upon how memories are stored within the brain. Right? And it's been proven that this technique, okay, produces better information, more accurate information, okay, your standard question and answer type interview. So if you've got an employment interview, you're going, well, for example, let's just say, I've had a complaint from Bob. They said that you shouted at them and said that they were useless and rubbish. Why did you do that? Okay, very close questioning. You've already, for the person being interviewed, you've made your judgment that they said it. Okay? Because this doesn't do that. So I'm going to explain it a little bit. If you consider that your brain, let me go back a little bit. If you imagine your laptop, I'm looking at a laptop here now, and you've got lots of information all over your desktop. I don't know if any of you do that. You just save all these files and everything on your desktop, and it's masses of folders, documents, because it's easy, because you can see it all there. But actually, when you're trying to look for something, it's quite messy. You're looking through, is it that one? Is it that one? So what you do to try and be organized is you set up separate folders. So they have all these folders so that everything is nicely contained in that part. So if it relates to, if we say a client, and you say, I'm dealing with this client. Oh yeah, that's that case, that client. There's my folder for that. I can go in there and there's all my documents. See, brain works pretty much the same. If you imagine the amount of information the brain is taking in, what happens is it's just messed up all over its head. So what it does is it separates it into folders. And memories are basically ordered into a gland, a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is just above each of your ears. Now, this interview technique is designed so that when you're interviewing, you're allowing them the opportunity to take time and draw that information from all the different parts of their brain. With cognitive interviewing, there are four key techniques to the approach. So on the first one here, mental reinstatement, what you're actually doing, I'll give you an example of this. This is actually where you say to someone, okay, I'm investigating an incident where occurred on this day in the interview room about 4:30 in the afternoon. I understand you were there, so just take time. If you could just remember back to that day, okay, take your time, and in your own words, tell me exactly what you remember happening. Okay, there's an example. In your own words, take your time. Tell me what you remember about that day. And then there's this different perspectives. And where that is where you say to someone, okay, so you're looking around, you know, considering who was in this room, picture in your mind, look around, who's around you. And then when they say, oh, well, this person was next to me, so, okay. So consider that individual and they're looking at what took place. What do you think they heard? What did they see? What would they have seen? And then you can get them to describe the event in several orders, and this is really important. So this is where, you know, generally you will ask, an incident happened on this day and time. Tell me what you remember, and they're likely to recall it in a certain order, generally from beginning to end, yeah, so from start to finish. They'll be going, oh, well, I walked in and I did, then I went over to the coffee machine and went back. And then what you can do, because they're remembering it, they're recalling it, but then you can say, okay, well, let's stop a minute. So at the time you were at the coffee machine, go back to the coffee machine. Just tell me what happened from now. So now what you're doing is you're not saying to them, just tell me everything that happened. You're focusing on a particular event, a different order, okay? So this is later on. You're saying, right, now think of that. Now, what that does is that means that they're trying now to focus on that particular incident and then trying to recall everything they can remember that they stored at that part of the event, rather than trying to remember the whole. And you can do that in different orders. So if, for example, you say they walked here, I went to the coffee machine, I went here, I went there, you say, okay, well, let's start from when you left the room. Let's just go back a step, just before you left the room. What happened? Do you recall? Who was around you? Okay. So again, you're trying to get them to think of the whole. You're getting them to tell you in their own words as they remember it, but you're also then saying, okay, take this part and now tell me what you remember. And you might find there are differences. You might find that, but that doesn't mean they're being deceptive. What that means is they're actually going to a part of their brain that stored that memory and retracting more. That's why this is an effective technique, because what it does is it gets people to focus on specific areas, and they may suddenly remember things that they didn't remember when you first asked the question. And in terms of in-depth reporting, that's really when you're trying to get a much bigger picture. And at that point, you say, okay, I understand something happened at, let's just say, an open air event. Yeah. So just walk me through and tell me, okay, tell me everything you remember. Tell me what the weather was like. Tell me, you know, was it dry? Was it raining? Was it sunny? Was it dark? Was it day, night? These things. You get them to really give you a real solid picture. So between these four techniques of cognitive interviewing, it's proven, psychological studies have proven that this is a method of getting witnesses to provide you with much more accurate information. And never believe that because someone goes, our automatic bias is that, okay, they're lying. Yeah, they're trying to make it up. Actually, that may not be the case, because if you're using this technique, it could be actually exploring their mind to find where that piece of information has been stored, and they're trying to retrieve it for you. And this is an advanced interviewing technique, it's very advanced, and obviously there's a lot more training around this, but I'm trying to give you a flavour of why investigations go wrong. Bias and a flawed investigation interview are the two areas for me. And often you need to know that you're going to be dealing with a lot of emotions, okay? And that's important, because when you're interviewing someone, you need to understand, depending on what you're investigating, Okay, they're going to go through a series of emotions, and it could be one, or it could be two, it could be all of these that are shown there. They could be happy, they could be sort of serious, they could be sad, they could be down, they could be crying, you know, they could be angry, be furious. But you have to understand that that's what's going to happen as an investigator. You need to allow them. There's nothing wrong with allowing someone to express their emotion. It generally passes. They need to get that out of their system. And you need to allow them to get it out of their system, because what you're trying to do is get to really what information you need, what facts really happened. What do you recall happened? Who was there? What did you see? One thing I've said on a few sessions is never underestimate the impact these emotions have on you as an investigator, and also that you will also potentially face these emotions yourself. Some of the cases you may investigate, I don't know your backgrounds, but some of the cases you may be traumatizing, really horrendous. Sometimes you need that time out. But all the while, you need to understand, as I said, understanding your own bias, you have to understand your own emotions. You also have to understand people you're interviewing, witnesses. So I said it's not going to be a long session. It was just giving you a flavour of what goes wrong. And there isn't a question. If you want to ask questions, please use the chat function. Slides off. But so just to recap on how you can avoid having your investigation criticised or picked apart, or whatever you want to explain. First of all, know your policies. Okay? I don't know about your experiences, but having sat, I was a witness about 2 or 3 years ago now, actually, about it, but a few years ago, where I was on the stand at an employment tribunal on a dismissal case where I dismissed an individual. And one of the key areas that I was questioned over was the policy. So as an investigator, first and foremost, know your policy. Know the policy that applies to your investigation or the allegation you're investigating, and then make sure you follow it. Make sure you know where your process is, what it is, what you need to do. Be clear on what you're investigating. In terms of reference, key. You need to know these are the policies that apply to this investigation, and this is what I'm being asked to investigate. As we be objective, do not allow yourself to be influenced. Okay. Say one thing. Well, a few questions I've had on this before. Clear influence. One thing for an investigator: you are not judge, jury, and executioner. You are there to conduct an objective investigation. You will identify whether there is a case to answer or not, which we'll talk about. Okay? But you will not then say, this has been breached, this individual should do this, and so they should go here. That's not your role. That's a separate role. Be fair. Treat everything and everyone fairly. Remember objectivity. I always look at it when I receive a complaint, in whatever format. Generally, it's a report or it's wherever it might be. My view is it's a piece of paper with words. It has no context, it has no depth, it has no breadth. It's just words. There's no emotion in there. The emotion, I think, if I read something, is suddenly based upon my bias. Remember what I'm saying? Bias influences everything we do. So I look at it as I speak to everyone, I treat everyone, complainant, respondent, if you're doing a criminal investigation, victim, suspect, you treat them fairly. Treat them fairly. And the evidence you receive, you treat that fairly. You don't place straight away on one or the other unless there's good reason to. As I said, I've said a couple of times now, but you're bored of hearing it, but beware of your bias. Use an open interview style, okay? So you all definitely know open close questioning techniques, okay? Cognitive interviewing is just an advanced process, an advanced system of conducting open interviewing style. It's very effective. listen to what you're being told. Again, bias influences out, believe it or not. Sometimes we hear what we want to hear. I've heard that phrase many times. So make sure you're listening to what's being said. And make sure your investigation is evidence-based. It's based upon evidence. Now, and my next slide says we work on employment investigations, particularly balance of probability. Be aware of the imbalance of probabilities. Because if your outcomes are not supported by evidence, then that's not the balance of probabilities. Also, on the converse side, if it's employment investigation, it's balance of probability is not beyond reasonable doubt. Now, that doesn't mean because there isn't evidence or there wasn't someone who saw what happened or there's no evidence that says it did happen, that it didn't happen. Balance of probabilities is drawing a conclusion based on all the evidence you have, and some evidence may support it. It's more likely than not that it did occur, which is another conversation altogether, maybe another webinar. And also make sure that your report is clear and concise and detailed. And the way I always explain investigation reports, so they should read like a book. You should have a middle, beginning, a middle, and an end, and you should be able to follow it. Just like a story, you should know exactly, well, this is what I was asked to investigate, these were the questions, this is what I did, this is the evidence I gathered, these are the people I interviewed, and this is the culmination of that has led me to this conclusion. This supports my conclusion. So there you go. That's pretty much it. As I say, if you want a question, use the chat box. I'll look out for that. But while we're doing that, I just want to say thank you all for joining. As I said, I will share the recording and the slides with you after today. Get that across to you all. I just want to say thanks for your time. It's a very, very hot day after we've had a nice cool spell. And I'll just give you a little bit about Lexham. As I said, I'm head of investigations, Gary Rogers, and my head of corporate services as a whole is Alexander Dunlop. Between us, we have extensive experience in conducting investigations. Alex comes from a legal background, as you probably see. I come from employment and it's a very short policing background. And if we can help in any way, that's my direct email address. There's our website address. That's my phone number. So on that, I shall now stop sharing. If you've got any questions whatsoever, please use the chat function. And I'll hang on for a little while just to see if anyone's got anything to say. But again, I want to say thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. Genuinely, I do. We are looking to run several more sessions like this, probably towards the end of the year, all designed on topics of goes on and what investigations, what challenges they face, and even if I can share some of that experience with you, that's great, and I'll certainly be looking to do that over the coming months into next year. Please do keep a check on us on LinkedIn. We're on LinkedIn. Please do look out for us. We are looking at planning some events. We do some training sessions. And generally, if there's anything we can do to help, please reach out to us if you want to know a little bit more about us. We offer investigation training, a 5-day CPD accredited course, as I said earlier, which we're happy to roll out for your organisation. Before I say, you have my contact details now, and if we can help in any way, please do get in touch with us. And again, thanks to every single one of you for joining me today, and appreciate your time. So I'll wait for you all. If you want to drop off, drop off. If you want to ask a question, please do. If you want to stay on and have a chat afterwards, that's fine as well. I will stop recording now so that if anyone wants to talk to me.